I'm Scott Weatherly. Welcome to 20th Century Geek. Since I started this podcast, I have focused on things that are part of my life. Superheroes, horror and movies. This made starting the podcast easier, but now I want to push myself and take on some subjects of which I don't have much knowledge. When thinking about where to start, I worked through a list of things that I wanted to know more about. This has led to a long list of topics that I will be looking into in the future, and probably become shows down the line. The subjects include everything from the mainstream, such as the 80s cartoon boom, to the more obscure, like the Wold Newton universe. In the end, I landed on a subject about a group of people that have been influencing and inspiring musicians and music lovers for decades. After a little research, I found myself wanting to know more about the origins, lives and legacies of two of the most important musical icons of the 20th century. The king himself, Elvis Presley, and the Fab Four, the Beatles. Each from very different backgrounds and creating vastly different sounds, but both establishing a foundation and legacy that would change the direction of pop music and influence musicians even today. Over the next two shows, I will be providing an overview of these two pop culture giants with some insight into and context of their history, and interviews with people that love them and share a passion for them. In the first part, we will travel back to Liverpool, England in the early 60s, and more specifically, the Cavern Club, where the Beatles were discovered by Brian Epstein. Although, that is jumping ahead a bit. Let's go back a few more years. In the late 1950s, a version of the group was coming together, made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and a very young George Harrison. They were playing gigs whenever they could get a drummer. They were joined by their first semi-permanent drummer Pete Best in 1960, when they were booked for a 3-month residency in Hamburg, Germany. The gig went well for a while, until the group was found to be working a second gig at the same time. This resulted in them losing both gigs and the underage Harrison being reported to the authorities. Over the next couple of years, they did sporadic gigs in Britain and back in Hamburg, as well as acting as a backing band for Polydor Records, who contracted them for a year. During this period, they were also performing more frequently at the Cavern Club, and were a popular mainstay of the Mersey beat scene. It was during one of these performances that they were watched by a local record store owner, Brian Epstein. Over the next couple of months, he got to know the band and was appointed their manager in January 1962. With Epstein on board, they worked to get out of their Hamburg and Polydor contracts, and in early 1962, the group was awarded a new contract with EMI Records. During the first sessions, the band agreed to drop Pete Best, and they were joined by Ringo Starr. Through these sessions, they recorded several songs: Love Me Do, Please Please Me, and P.S. I Love You. Of these, Love Me Do was released as the band's first single and reached number 17 in the UK charts. If 1962 saw the band come together, 1963 saw them become a sensation. With guidance from Epstein, they established a unified and more professional look on stage. They also recorded their debut LP, Please Please Me, in Abbey Road. It is agreed by all involved that the first album was rushed, with a little thought going into the songwriting process other than creating catchy tunes. This paid off as the album reached number 1 in most charts. It was described as having a fresh and vibrant feel that can be attributed to its rushed and intense creation. This was soon followed by their second album, With the Beatles, which also reached number 1. They were on a roll of success that would mean the majority of their albums from that point on would reach the top of the charts. It was also in this album cover blurb that they were first referred to as the Fabulous Foursome, which was quickly abbreviated to the now iconic Fab Four. In the UK and parts of Europe, they had made it. They were established and the fan base was growing massively. In the US, however, the story was a little more complicated. Due to a number of royalty and ownership rights, as well as a management shake-up at the record companies that Epstein had approached, They had very little exposure the other side of the pond. Tired of having to work through other people, Epstein took charge of the situation in late 1963 and arranged for a $40,000 advertising campaign and got the support of a DJ called Carol James. Exposure on one show translated into further demand and appearances on other stations, causing a wave of exposure and demand across the entire US. In reaction, Capitol Records, the US branch of EMI Records, released I Want to Hold Your Hand in December 1963. It was at number 1 by the January 1964. The Fab Four arrived in New York in mid-Feb 1964 to a roaring crowd of fans. During this US tour, they would experience a series of events that mirrored Elvis's first TV experience, which says more about America's fear of rock and roll than it does about the individuals involved. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show to a huge, record-breaking audience. However, the following day there was a rash of negative critical reviews. The critics may not have been won over, but the fans were in love, and the live shows were attended by huge, screaming crowds. Beatlemania was born. Wanting to ride the tsunami of success, United Artists approached the band with a 3-film deal, planning on making the money from the soundtrack sales. The first of these films, A Hard Day's Night, was directed by Richard Lester, director of Superman 2 and 3. The film was a critical and financial success, as was the accompanying soundtrack. Some even suggest that this is the first time the true spirit and sound of the band is captured. And not wanting to let success wane, the band went on an intense international touring schedule. Each show attended by between 10 and 20,000 fans, packing the venues to bursting. Their sound as a pop band struck a chord with the growing youth culture, but a meeting in the summer of 1964 would instigate a change of direction for at least one member of the band. In August, the four were introduced to Bob Dylan. At the time, the fan base of each was considered to be worlds apart. The Beatles appealing to the teeny bopper youth market with pop music and a rock and roll feel, while Dylan's folk stylings and political leanings appealed to college students and the politically active. This meeting, however, had an impact on John Lennon, who started imitating Dylan to a degree and encouraging the other members, and possibly their audience, to grow up a little. This is further demonstrated in the next studio album, Beatles for Sale, which due to extensive touring and engagements lacked original material. However, what there was sounded different. The Lennon-McCartney partnership was developing. This developing maturity and style continued to grow through 1965 and 66, influenced in no small part to the introduction of LSD and other drugs. This culminated in the album Rubber Soul, and this album marked a massive step away from the typical pop music that had started them off. They were trying and succeeding in pushing themselves musically and lyrically. They may have been grown artistically, but 1966 saw the boys have a run of unfortunate media mishaps. While touring in the Philippines, Epstein declined a request for them to appear at the presidential palace. It turns out that declining such an invite results in riots and attempted attacks. The band barely made it out of the country. This was soon followed by a much greater faux pas during an interview that was printed in an American magazine called Datebook. During the interview, John Lennon stated, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was alright, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." Religious groups across America and parts of Europe reacted with anger and protests to the comment. Their albums were removed from shops and radio stations took them from the rotation. While this reduced their exposure, it did not reduce the fervour of their fans. While on tour in the US in 1966, they knew that during the shows no one could hear the music over the screaming of the crowds. They had made such progress with their music that they had become bored with the routine of the live shows without the music having an impact. It was decided that this would be their last live tour, and they would focus on their music. And focus they did. Back in the studio, they wanted to push their experimental progression and include as many influences as possible. An alleged 700 hours of studio time later, and the result was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, which was released in June 1967. Almost immediately, the lyrics and cover of the band started to be studied for meaning both open and hidden. This academic study continues today. As McCartney said at the time, "We write songs, we know what we mean by them, but in a week someone else is saying something about it, and you can't deny it. You put your own meaning at your own level to our songs." The band was now at its zenith, artistically and commercially, but would receive a blow that would act as a catalyst to the band's eventual breakup. In August 1967, Brian Epstein passed away following a drug overdose. This left the band rudderless and vulnerable. Epstein had been the linchpin for the four members of the band, acting as a calming influence and taking control of the business elements. His death was a great blow for the band. Removing his influence allowed cracks in the foundations of the group to appear. In order to ensure the family would have some privacy from the media and the prying fans, the Beatles did not attend his funeral. Over the next 18 months, 3 albums were released: Magical Mystery Tour, Yellow Submarine, and the White Album. Each contained more material highlighting the artistic growth of not just the group, but the individuals involved. During the studio sessions of the White Album, this individual growth led to open division between the four. Without the arbitration and guidance of Epstein, the Fab Four's personalities started to clash. This was soon followed by the band's first negatively received output, the Magical Mystery Tour. The associated soundtrack was well received, but the actual film received critical and fan bashing. Both considered it to be a slightly conceited bag of rubbish. This was balanced out by the much more positive response to the following up film and soundtrack, Yellow Submarine. The imbalance of these two films highlighted the lack of direction in the band. Looking for guidance, the Fab Four turned to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, travelling to India for a planned 3-month stay. Ringo left within 2 weeks, shortly followed by Paul McCartney. John Lennon and George Harrison stayed on longer, hoping to find something deeper, but both returned a few weeks later. Still without a leader, they returned to the studio to try and work through the troubles. Unfortunately, this didn't work. By this stage, each of the guys had taken an interest in different musical avenues, which in some cases were in direct conflict. Lennon started to consider McCartney's contributions populist rubbish. He further frustrated the recordings by bringing his new interest to the sessions, avant-garde artist Yoko Ono. Such divisive interests and tastes led to an album that each of the four agree was not a true Beatles album. They may have all contributed, but each song was an individual effort. The Beatles, also referred to as the White Album, was not received with the enthusiasm of previous albums. Many considered it unfocused and indulgent. By the start of 1969, the band was in disarray, and it was becoming more and more obvious that the time in the recording studio for the White Album had marked the start of the band coming apart. The group's issues continued during the creation and recording of both Let It Be and Abbey Road. On a number of occasions, one or more of the four abandoned the sessions or laid down demands regarding how they believed the album should be created. Despite the eventual outputs being well regarded, the stress and tension had brought the band to an impasse. A final nail was slammed home during the production of these albums, as the band argued over who should manage the band's legal and financial matters. Lennon and Harrison wanted the former manager of the Rolling Stones, Alan Klein. McCartney demanded Lee and John Eastman. When no agreement could be reached, both were appointed in financial and legal supporting roles. This, however, did not resolve the issue, and further conflict grew, resulting in McCartney refusing to sign a new management contract with Klein. He was overruled by the other members. A new contract was not enough to save them, though, and on September 20th, 1969, John Lennon announced he was leaving the band. This was not publicly announced until all completed material was released. Once the albums had been released, Paul McCartney filed a legal action that dissolved the band and led to years of further legal conflict. However, as far as the public and fans were concerned, the Beatles were no longer together. That may have been the end of the band, but it was not the end of the Beatles. Even now, over 40 years after the band's dissolution, there are legions of dedicated fans around the world that love and celebrate the band's music and style. While I've provided a brief history of the Beatles' active years, to get a better understanding of what people love about them, I contacted the British Beatles Fan Club, more specifically, Ernie Sutton, the fan club's treasurer and long-time Beatles devotee. I interviewed him recently, and he has some very interesting things to say about the fan club, its history, and his love of the Beatles. So the fan club then was created out of the London Beatles fan club. So were you a part of that, the original London scene?
I wasn't a part of the original London fan club. That was formed in the 80s.
Oh, wow, okay.
Our membership secretary, Terry Bloxham, was a part of that. And it was initially run by a chap called Richard Porter, who runs a Beatles coffee shop and does Beatles tours these days.
In London? Is it in London or Liverpool?
That's in London, yes.
Oh, okay.
And eventually that folded. And in 2000... our editor Pete Nash decided to resurrect the London Beatles Fan Club with a magazine. Mm-hmm. And we were very kindly helped out by a chap called Howard Cohen, who runs the London Beatles store in Baker Street. And he helped us fund the first few magazines until we were up and running. And then within 3 years, it grew to such a degree that it turned into the British Beatles Fan Club.
Wow.
And I suddenly became a member around that time because I used to purchase the old Beatle monthly magazines.
Oh, okay.
Which,
so you were... yes.
Which stopped printing around 2003. I was looking for something else and I came across the British Beatles Fan Club.
Oh, okay.
So that's how I got involved with that. And then eventually it got bigger and bigger and it needed more people to do different jobs.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up being the treasurer.
Okay, so yeah, so it's gone from strength to strength then, really.
It's gone from strength to strength, yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
And with social media as well, we've got lots of people that like us on Facebook and Twitter and all of that stuff. But we still do a magazine because we've still got a very healthy fan base for that. Yes.
No, I think it sounds daft. You know, like I hear people talk a lot about digital and things these days, but I have to admit I love a good fanzine. I'm still very, I'm the book kind of person. I love the tactile nature of it. So that's really good. I love that. So before you're sort of joining the fan club, and obviously you had the monthly magazine. What was your first exposure to the Beatles then?
It was when I was very young, when I was around 4 or 5 years old. My mum used to have a transistor radio in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And she always had it on while she did housework or cooking, because in those days most of the women, most of the wives were housewives. They didn't go out to work, so there was always this music going on around me, and my mum kind of sensed that I liked the Beatles because I kind of stood up and listened when a Beatles record came on.
Your ears pricked up.
And and then around 1964, my parents made a kind of pact with me that if I did well at school in a term, I could have the next single that came out. So that's how I got my first single in 1964, and then my collection and interest in them just grew and grew and grew.
Okay, so the incentive was there to do well at school.
The incentive was to do well at school, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you see your collection grew. So obviously with a lot of these things, it starts with the easy stuff, like say the records, the albums, that sort of thing. But what does your collection include then now at the moment?
Well, it includes the obvious things: the records, CDs these days, books, magazines, autographs, toy. I've still got a toy guitar from 1964 that my grandmother bought me, and it's still got the strings on it, and it still plays.
Fantastic.
Photographs hanging on the wall, just loads of it, really.
Yeah. So from so from a memorabilia and taking part kind of view, I see that you took part in the Take It Away video in 1982.
I did, yes.
And that was with who was it? Paul McCartney.
Go Starr.
Yeah.
Was there. Their two wives, Linda McCartney and Barbara Starr.
Yeah.
As well as the Beatles producer George Martin.
Oh wow! So was that the first time you'd met them, or was it?
That was the first time I'd actually met them and shook hands with them.
Mm.
Yes, which we were allowed to do at the end, and because we were actually part of an audience for a concert scene in the video.
Yes. Okay, that's it. Yeah.
And then at the end, we all got the chance to get autographs and say hello. And I think Ringo was a bit miffed because everyone kind of made a beeline towards Paul.
Yeah.
So I went to Ringo first, and I think he was quite chuffed.
You made his day. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've done my research onto the Beatles, trying to get a bit more of an understanding, and I will admit that my knowledge was more around sort of like I know the songs, I know the albums, but I didn't really know a great deal about the people, and I didn't really know anything about their history. So really, I saw that when I started to look at their history from the late 50s when they were coming together, and people seem to say 1960 was their starting point. What? Is that what is there? Would you disagree with that, or is that sort of the kick-off point?
It depends what you call the starting point. I mean, the 1960 was the time that they first started to go to Germany to play, and John, Paul, and George were in place by then.
Yeah.
But before that, in 1957, John and Paul were in a band called the Quarrymen, and it was only later that George joined, and Ringo didn't join until about 3 months before their first record came out.
Yeah,
so a starting point. 1960 would be a good starting point because I think that was the time that they went across to Germany and played the clubs in Hamburg and started to gel as a band, really.
So I mean, that time in Germany seems really important because obviously, on the road, that sort of forms you as a band, as a sort of a unit. Makes you quite tight, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, they were playing 8 hours a night a lot of the time.
Yeah. That's a full day's work every night.
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. Yeah. So what, and again, this is just my interpretation of sort of like what I've read and the history and that. So they were coming together, they were sort of to garner some level of success, but is it right to say that really their step up was when they came under Brian Epstein and he was able to get them a better contract?
It was, yeah. The manager before them was a chap called Alan Williams, and he'd arranged the trips to Germany, along with some other Liverpool bands that he managed. But when Brian came along, Brian was like this chap in a posh suit and everything, and he had contacts in London, so he was the one that came down to London to try and get them record deals. And eventually he got them one at EMI after they'd been turned down by virtually everybody else. He managed to get a tape recording of them, and he took that round to various record companies. Unfortunately, it was a tape they did for Decca on New Year's Day 1962, and it was pretty cold.
Right, yeah.
So it wasn't a brilliant recording he was taking round, but
no.
He did end up meeting George Martin, who apparently didn't like the music at first.
Right.
But when he met the Beatles, he liked them.
Yeah.
So he thought, I'll give them a chance and give them a go.
Yeah, and obviously it rose from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I mean that's what I find really fascinating is that, when you look at history, it's these little things can make such a big difference. So just meeting, because Brian Epstein, he saw them on stage, didn't he? And he was determined to become their manager. Then he ran a record.
His parents owned a huge furniture store in Liverpool, and Brian ran the records section. They had a little section of records.
Yeah.
Brian ran that, and it was only one day when a chap came in and asked for a Beatles record that Brian found out he suddenly didn't have it. in stock, so he'd never heard of this band.
Oh, okay.
And then he found out that they were playing just down the road at the Cavern Club.
Yeah.
And went to see them there and met them afterwards, and that's how he hooked up with them initially.
Oh, okay. So I'll say it's very fortuitous then.
Yeah. So if that chap had not walked into that record shop.
No. Yeah. It'd be a very different story.
Be a different story. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So they sort of, they take off. They start to get success, and one of the interesting things I found about all the sort of 60s music scene, and like I said, Elvis did something similar. It was the movies, these the jukebox musicals and stuff. So
yeah,
was this a sort of when I look at some of the others, it seems a bit more strategic, like they're doing it to broaden their appeal. But the Beatles look more like they're just having a laugh. Was it intentional? Or was it just sort of like for fun, something they could do?
Well, when they became really big in '64 and they were touring the world, they obviously couldn't go everywhere on the planet. So the idea of the first film was to put that out across the world, so that people would have access to them if they couldn't get to a concert or whatever. So that was the idea of the first film, and the first film was actually filmed in black and white because the producers wouldn't stump up the money for a colour film.
Oh, really?
Because they kind of thought, this is a passing phase. The Beatles will...
A flash in the pan sort of thing.
Yeah, a flash in the pan. They'll be gone in a couple of years. So by the time they did their second one, they stumped up the money to do that in colour because they suddenly realised they were onto a good thing, I think. Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, they do seem... I watched bits and pieces of all of them, really, to sort of see, how they sort of fit together, and... They just seem to be having a really good time for the most part, and I thought that was really interesting.
They were very happy at that time.
Yeah.
64, 65. They were enjoying it. It was only, I think, 66 onwards that it really became some of it became a bit of a drag for them. The touring and all the problems they had.
Yeah.
On the tours in '66.
Was that when they stopped? Was that when they stopped touring? So '66.
That's when they stopped. Yeah.
What caused that?
They were getting fed up with the fact that they couldn't be heard on stage, and that the fans were screaming all the time, and that they felt that people were just there to see them and not listen.
Yeah.
But they ended up going to. They did a tour to Tokyo in Japan. Mm-hmm. And played a place called the Budokan Hall in Tokyo.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And they got a very hostile reception from some of the Japanese because it was classed as a war memorial for the war dead. Oh. And they objected to this long-haired group turning up and playing there.
Yeah.
And they went from there to the Philippines, and apparently, without their knowledge, they apparently snubbed the president. There was some invitation that they never got. So they got bad press about snubbing the president. And then John made his comment. Well, John's comment came out that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. Just at the time they were about to tour America, which was the last tour they did.
So you've insulted the Japanese, you've insulted the Philippines, and now you've insulted the American Bible Belt.
Yeah, and by the end of that tour, they'd all decided that was it. They weren't going to tour anymore. And they found homage in the studio after that, and were able to develop their sounds and be more creative that way.
Yeah, it's interesting actually you say that, because one of the things, you said about developing their sounds, towards like the mid-60s and stuff, it seems the group's growing like diversity in the mid-60s, allowed them to create some really interesting songs. The sort of touches of the Indian music, but keeping it with the pop and all the more modern stuff.
Yeah.
So that's all the influences. It makes them very diverse and obviously a bit more different to anything else out there.
And the Beatles were instrumental in when they started to record. They'd go to the studio and they'd be told by management, "Oh, you've got 3 hours and you've got to come out with 2 songs." Or something like that.
Yeah.
So 3 hours was the limit, and then they were out.
Yeah.
But by the time they were doing Rubber Soul, at the end of '65, the studios were letting them have basically their own time that they wanted to create it, because they knew that something good was going to come out of it. So from that, all the other groups of the time that were into by the time they got to psychedelia, people like Pink Floyd, they were being given more studio time by the record companies.
So the success
and that's why I think the music developed, because the groups were being given that time to create, rather than being told you've got X number of hours to do X number of songs.
So it becomes less like a production line, and actually they're allowing these creative people to be creative.
Creative, yeah, exactly.
Wow, so that's a real legacy to have then. You're allowing to turn that corner.
Yeah.
To flip that over though, it seems sort of in that period then, that growing diversity in tastes and the objectives of what they wanted to do, did that contribute to them sort of, the breakup, the eventual breakup, or, the differences between them?
There are a lot of things that contributed to the breakup. The first thing was Brian Epstein dying,
of course,
in 1967, and they basically found themselves with kind of no leadership, and they'd stopped touring. So it was Paul that got them into. He kind of said, "Look, chaps, we've got to do something here."
Yeah.
So they went out and made the Magical Mystery Tour film, which wasn't a great success when it came out, but it's now regarded as an excellent film. So by this time, John and Paul were writing separately anyway, most of the time, and they went off to India for 3 months.
Yeah.
I think Ringo came back after a week, Paul after about a month, and John and George stayed there for 3 months.
Right.
And by the time they come back, they'd got enough material to do the White Album.
Okay.
But there were rows and everything else during that, because they'd come back with so many songs. George was unhappy that he wasn't getting enough of his songs on the albums. John didn't like the way Paul was creating songs. He didn't like songs like Obla Di Obla Da.
Yeah.
And Paul was getting a bit fed up because Yoko Ono by then was in the studio. So there were a lot of things that were contributing towards it. But I think the main thing, by the time they did break up, I think that they'd come full circle. If you hear their last album, it's very much a basic album, which is kind of going back to where they started.
Yeah.
So they basically done, I think, what they could, and they weren't developing anymore.
Too much compromise between everybody, sort of flattened it all out.
Yeah. The classic one is when Abbey Road came out. John chose the songs for the first side, and Paul chose the songs for the second side.
Right.
They were that diverse.
Right.
That they couldn't even agree on what was to go on the album as a pair.
So, do you think if Brian Epstein could have prevented this? Do you think if he was still around, they would have lasted a lot longer?
That's a difficult question to answer. Brian would have been able to manage Apple for them, which is the corporation they set up that lost a hell of a lot of money, which is why John, George and Ringo brought in a chap called Alan Klein that Paul disliked straight away. But Brian could have run Apple.
Yeah.
But having said that, at the time of Brian's death, he wasn't really needed that much by the Beatles, because they stopped touring. They were going into the studio. They were under George Martin's supervision, and Brian was kind of left with nothing to do.
Yeah,
if you know what I mean. So Apple, I think, would have been good for Brian had he lived. But whether he would have kept them together or not, I actually doubt that very much, because musically they were growing apart. And George in particular was flourishing as a songwriter. And I think he was the one, when they broke up, that really developed the most initially.
The freedom to be more creative again.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. So, looking at the period of the time, you mentioned like the early 60s and stuff, that I mean, Britain at the time was a very, very different place. There was no social media, there was no... TV was very limited, and, the rest. So it's understandable why they were so popular at the time. They were obviously a breakaway from the norm. Why do you think they're still so popular? What makes them have such a strong appeal, even 50 years later?
I think something else why they were popular in the early 60s was because I found when I was growing up that my parents liked them as well. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think that generation that were from my parents' time kind of lost a chunk of their childhood due to the Second World War. Yeah. And the Beatles kind of gave them that back, if you see what I mean, but a bit later in life when they were in their 20s or early 30s. But I think they're still popular today because they still are influencing other artists. Other artists are covering their songs. Paul is still touring. And we certainly find in the fan club when Paul goes out on tour, the membership inquiries suddenly increase.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's like when the new movie came out this year, 8 days a week, we suddenly had a surge of new memberships because of that.
It's good. I mean, that's good. I mean, it shows that sort of they still are popular. Then they're for every generation, really.
I think the main thing. I think the main thing in their legacy will always be the music that they made. Yes. And their music is kind of everywhere. So if adults have something on in the house, then kids listen to it and hear it. And of course, children can pick up on the cartoon film Yellow Submarine or the song Yellow Submarine and say, "Oh, who's that?" And I just think it's the music that is so profound, and it's a lot of it is timeless. Some of it is dated. Some of the early stuff is probably dated now. Yeah. But certainly the later stuff certainly hasn't. And the music, I think, will always be the thing. No, I agree. I think that's a really good point. I think they are so entrenched in British pop culture that they will always be. People, every generation will be exposed to them in such a positive way. I suppose. Yeah, I mean, the people even talk about them in schools now. Yeah. I mean, I've seen them on school posters with timelines, and you get to the 60s, and there's what's happened in the 60s, and there's always a picture of the Beatles in there. Yeah. And even when you pick up books and magazines from the time, the Beatles are very predominant in a lot of the books about the 60s. Oh yeah, I mean they defined an era. Defined it, yeah. I mean every film set in the 60s, you're going to get a Beatles song or and the look and the suits, the hair, and everything. Yeah. Exactly. They are quintessentially British. Very much so, yes. Okay. That's brilliant. That's been fascinating. Right. Final question then. Yeah. What's your favourite album? Favourite album? Oh, now, favourite albums of mine change from time to time. My favourite song hasn't. My favourite song is Strawberry Fields. Excellent song. But if I had to pick an album now, I would probably pick Revolver. Okay, yeah. Because that's something. I mean, that's predominant this year because it's the 50th anniversary. So I've listened to that quite a lot because I've done a couple of radio shows about the album. Yeah. So that one for me at the moment is top of my list, but tomorrow it could be something else. whatever mood takes you, they have got something for it. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, well, before we wrap up, how can people find you, and how can they inquire about the fan club if they wanted? We have a website, www.britishbeatlesfanclub.co.uk, and if there's different tabs across the top, if you just click the inquiries tab or the membership tab, there's a drop-down email if you want to contact us, but all the information about joining or subscribing or buying any of our back issues and special tribute magazines on John and George is all on the website. Fantastic. Excellent. Ernie, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. While talking to Ernie was great, and I learned a lot about the history of the Beatles, I still felt something was missing from why the fans loved the Beatles.
So I bit the bullet. I was a brave, brave boy, and I turned to my father-in-law, Roy Browett, who's been a Beatles fan since he was a boy in the 60s. We sat down the other day and had a bit of a chat. Roy, thank you for taking the time to do the interview. So we're going to talk about you and the Beatles and how the part they've taken in your life, and some of your music, and if they've influenced it, and how that sort of come about. So, really, what was your experience of the Beatles, and what was it like to have them appear in your life as a boy, really, I suppose?
Quite exciting, really, and the excitement gathered pace as I got older and became more knowledgeable of the Beatles and more knowledgeable of music as well. I guess my first experience with the Beatles was in late primary school, where they came on the scene about 1963. Probably the first record that had an impact was She Loves You. Mm-hmm. And then you have an interest then in what went before that, so some of their earlier stuff, which weren't necessarily written by Lennon and McCartney. But from She Loves You onwards, I followed the Beatles as well as I could, really, in those days. The problem with the early 60s, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, music was rationed somewhat to listening for a record on the radio. It was the era before pop stations launched officially with the BBC Radio 1 in 1967. Didn't really have access to the pirates at an early age.
I was going to ask about this. Those came a bit later on, did they, than the pirate stations?
Yeah, but they were there from probably 64, 65, but because of my age, I didn't really have my own radio or the ability to track them. So really, I followed the Beatles as well as I could, and reading in magazines and newspapers as much about them as individuals as well. And I remember the day I was able to go to school, primary school, and quote all their names off by heart, which was quite a proud moment.
So really, there was a playground following them when they came about. Then was it?
Yes, there was, and even in those days there was a demarcation in the school between those people who follow the Beatles and those who like the Rolling Stones, even at primary school.
So even early on, then there was a division in the thing. So how did the Beatles stand out to you then? So
well, Beatles by far more structured music, more polished. Even by the standards of 1963, which before the age of digital and multi-track, they were still better produced and more polished. By design, because the Stones focused on blues, which is a more raw format. But I was impressed by the structure of Beatles songs.
So technically, were they more proficient? Were they better musicians, or was it just that
they came across as better musicians, probably because their music was better constructed. But that's not necessarily true. The Rolling Stones are talented musicians, but a different genre, really.
Okay.
More blues, R&B.
Yeah.
Which
So
tends to be delivered in a less polished way.
I should say more raw.
Yes.
It's got
So not necessarily worse musicians for that, but it's just different.
So really, they stood out to you. They came about sort of like I say early 60s, 63. I think is like I say their breakout year. They had a very specific. I suppose like tone and sort of like I say they were pop. They were very good specific look.
Instantly recognisable on the radio.
Yes.
If I walked into a room and heard a Beatles record, I knew it was a Beatles record. Didn't have to wait till the end of the track to be told.
Yes.
So within a couple of years, I could tell who was singing on the record as well. So I developed recognition of individual voices: McCartney, Lennon. Predominantly Lennon and McCartney in those days, and later George Harrison and Ringo Starr.
So that's sort of like that starting point for them. That sort of like I say the polished sound, which was very, it was I think what really got them off the ground. Their evolution then. So when they actually they start to evolve and they take on the more psychedelic tape trains. Did you enjoy that? Was it interesting at the time, or was it something different?
Different. I wouldn't call myself innovative or at the vanguard of music. I always found a change to a musical style a little bit challenging first, and then later I became comfortable with that and realised that this is a relevant progression that somebody's made, and it's good, and they will move on. But as an individual, I'm not avant-garde type person. I tend to digest it first, then decide whether I like it. But with the Beatles, it was always a case of yes, their next project or style was good. I found it good and exciting, although it took a few listenings before I realised that.
Actually, because I say, because I think like we were discussing before the recording, I've heard Beatles songs. I don't think I've ever really sat through an album, which was so you can get in preparation for doing all these recordings. I sat through a couple of albums, and hearing them do an album is a different experience to listening to a Beatles song, because it's within context of what they're doing at that time, which I find a lot more interesting actually.
Yes.
So listening to, if you listen to like Sgt. Pepper as a whole, as opposed to just listening to one of their songs, it sort of becomes in the context of their evolution, like you say, which I can completely, and then listening to them in order, like the White Album and listening, I can see why, because they're so different at times.
Yes. One of the fears the Beatles always had was that their new record or their new album would be accepted by their fans and the musical establishment, because they were always breaking new ground, pushing the frontiers, and obviously that's what I alluded to before. As a listener to that music, it took me a few reviews or listens to a new record before I actually accepted that this was the new Beatles. Yeah. And it just moved on, and you never knew what was coming next.
Yeah, I think it was quite exciting.
I always enjoyed what came next. It was just, I think one of the most, or the best example of that is probably first listening to Strawberry Fields, which was quite almost psychedelic in some aspects, and the use of sound to create the ambience for the record. That is a classic, but at the time I needed to listen to it a little bit before I decided it was good.
Yeah.
Whereas the other side of that record, Penny Lane, was a little bit more traditional Beatles, instantly recognisable, instantly likeable.
Yeah.
The avant-garde stuff, such as Strawberry Fields, took a little bit longer. Looking back, though, they're all classics.
Yeah, their entire catalogue is everything I listened to. Even like I say, it's just a variety. There was, and I haven't really been exposed massively to the Beatles myself, other than the odd song, as you know them. There's nothing bad. Even the songs I don't know, like their B-sides or even their sort of less more obscure, there was no song I ever thought was, I'm not a big fan of this. They're all like, I can happily listen to all of it.
Yes.
One of the things I found though is listening to the albums and the different things. At the time, I was like I say, they would have been innovative and that sort of thing. Coming at it sort of so many years later, it was interesting to see that it felt less innovative, but only because of all the influenced bands I've heard since. Everything from the Britpops and that. So, from your point of view, can you see their legacy as you've grown up? Can you see their legacy and their influence on strongly in other bands?
Absolutely, yes. To the point where the Beatles covered such a wide variety of styles in their music during their short period. They virtually precluded a lot of new stuff coming through, because a lot of it was considered, well, this has been done before, and not just probably the Beatles, but the whole of the first generation of early 60s musicians probably laid the footprint for probably 95% of pop that's come through since.
I think it'd be quite easy to almost trace, pretty much any band you could trace their influences back. And like you say, I think a majority of them would probably end up at the Beatles or the Stones in some sort of capacity. Yes. It is. I couldn't. Like you say, I couldn't separate them from their legacy.
in a way. Listening to them, I could hear Oasis, I could hear Pulp, I could hear all these 90s Britpop bands more directly. But then I could also hear other psychedelic bands and other bands, everything from, like you say, everything from that other period that I know as a pop band.
Yes.
So yeah, I do think, like I say, their legacy is massive. So their influence, did they influence you in your musical styles? Because obviously you're a musician yourself, you play multiple instruments. Did they influence you, or were you?
Not directly, if I'm honest. I probably absorbed a lot of the musical phrasing of the Beatles. I developed in the mid '60s, or towards the end of the '60s, an interest in specifically singer-songwriters. Bob Dylan, for instance, Paul Simon, people like James Taylor, Gordon Lightfoot, various others, and I developed my guitar playing along those lines, so it wasn't pop orientated. It tended to be influenced by people like that more than anything. However, I still listened intently to Beatles records, and in fact I found years later, listening to particular tracks by other people, how much they've been influenced by the Beatles themselves. So I wouldn't say I've been influenced, but I can give you a number of examples where, say, somebody like Paul Simon, I believe, has been influenced by the Beatles during his formative years and in some of the songs he's developed.
No, it's true. It must be that period of time must have been almost inescapable to not see them as the sort of the granddaddies of it all, really. Yes,
I a few examples I could give would be the end to The Boxer, which the chorus of Lie La Lie was less than 12 months after the release of Hey Jude, which had a similar, very extended, repetitive phase out to the record.
Okay.
And I could cite a few other examples of that type of thing being carried over.
So their influences were just popping up.
Yes.
Not consistently, but you could hear them in specific songs and that sort of thing.
Yes, and another example I could give is a track called Save the Life of My Child by Paul Simon, who introduced one of his older songs overplayed on the new record, which again is something the Beatles used in All You Need Is Love, where they started singing She Loves You at the end of the record, that type of thing. So the more you listen to records, the more you realise that maybe that artist has been influenced by that other artist.
You can see the traces in things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whether it's intentional or sublime, I don't know, but that's how I've interpreted it over the years.
Yeah. I suppose they say it could be anything from each band is, like you say, it could be a member of the band's listened to it and decided they want to go with it, or even the producer's gone, I really like that sound, we'll try and see if it works for that singer-songwriter.
I mean, the examples I've just given you are subtle. The blatant adoption of the Beatles style has got to be Oasis. I think some of their phrasing, musical phrasing and mechanisms they use are picked directly from Beatles tracks.
Yes. Oh yeah,
no question about it.
Yeah, and I think there are sort of, we'll say, listening to some of the albums, I almost could put an Oasis album.
Yes.
Follow it on, and they could probably blend in many different ways.
Yes. I mean, as an example of there's the track on Sgt. Pepper called Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, where it comes to an abrupt end and then proceeds to the next verse. And if you listen to an Oasis record recently, the name escapes me, they use exactly the same mechanism in that record. Yeah,
it's an interesting sort of thing, because I've listened to it digitally. I checked my phone to see if it would stop. It just literally just stop, and I was a bit like, is I've pressed something. So, I think I have seen those sort of like techniques and stuff do crop up again and again. And I think even I could even, like you say, when you quote those sorts of things, I can in my head, my sort of style of music, I can imagine those influences on like Iron Maiden, and even later Metallica. where they've tried to become more like less heavy, and it's actually become more melodic and stuff. And there are certain trappings of things, like I say, the overplay or the abrupt end or different things that clearly go back to experimental Beatles tracks.
Yes.
So from all the stuff they created, then, do you have a favourite album or song that you go back to, or?
I guess favourite album is probably Sgt. Pepper. It's the first album, as I understand, as a concept album, where there is some link between previous tracks, subsequent tracks. Yes, it's just a complete work of art, really. Much has been said about its front piece, the Peter Blake front cover, but I think the music itself, without that, stands out way above anything else of the period.
I'd have to agree. I think of all the albums I listened to, that's one I went back to the most.
Yes.
Like, I enjoyed it end to end, and it worked as a whole.
Yes.
I found it quite interesting. I don't know what your thoughts were, but because it opens with the "Hope you enjoy the show," you know, and then there's the "Hope you enjoyed the show," and then it's followed by almost like I forget the name of the track now.
Help for My Friends.
Help for My Friends.
Yes.
There's almost like an encore, and it feels a bit like you are listening to a live show.
Yes.
Like they've completed it, and then they've gone back and they've come out and done the final song.
Yes.
But the tempo and the tone, or the mood of the final song, A Day in the Life.
Yes.
So it's very different to this album. It seems a bit more somber. I don't know if it's a Lennon song or a McCartney song, or it's very. I think that's why I like the album so much.
It's a Lennon song, A Day in the Life, but with a middle eight from Paul McCartney, I believe, who does the bus scene. I went upstairs, had a smoke.
Yes.
And then there's that period psychedelic episode. So it's a good mix of two different styles blended beautifully into one song.
Yes. I just want to. There's two songs I'm going to refer to it again. There were two songs on the album that really stood out to me, and that was one of them. A Day in the Life is one of those I've listened to, but is I think it's actually Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Yes.
Is a fantastic song. I really enjoyed it.
Now I'm not sure whether it sounds like that was a John Lennon song, and it's typified by. I think something new at the time was you were always surprised by the words Lennon chose to rhyme with other words. They weren't the obvious. They are not the obvious choice.
No.
That's what made it so vital and exciting.
I'd agree. I think the lyrics in it, because I listened to it all through, and when I went back, it's that thing that I did. You started listening to the lyrics, and in my head I'm like, is this nonsense, or is there sense in it? And the more you listen to it, there is. It's just very well chosen.
Yes. Very
well structured. As a lyricist, he really was very clever. I think.
Yes.
Okay.
That was probably one of the good examples of the avant-garde style of the Beatles. At that time, it stood out a mile. 10 years later, it would have been part of the norm.
Yes.
And that's how far ahead they were.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, actually. Like I say, still bands. Actually, listen to this album. There's a song from the 70s called Blockbuster.
Yes.
That kept springing to mind. And I can't remember who wrote it or performed it. But it's a very 70s song. But it kept feeling like that song was so Sgt. Pepper. In that thing of like throughout the song, it changes tone, it does this.
Yes.
And it just sort of, like you say, I think it came out in 73, 74. But clearly, like you say, they were so ahead of their time that something that became the norm later is you go back and think, oh wow, this album was released in, like you say, in 73, 74. It would have probably been lost in the mix a little bit, I suppose.
Yes.
Okay, so if there was someone coming up to experience the Beatles now, where would you advise them to start?
You mean regarding their music?
In general, really, actually.
I would say, like most groups, I'd say start at the beginning and then work your way through to the end. the thing with a lot of artists in the 60s where I suddenly discovered them was they had a back catalogue, and going back is interesting, but I think it's good to actually start to listen to people and as early as possible and see how they develop. Because that way you can probably just plot their progress in terms of how they move their sort of the craft on.
Experience their evolution with them.
Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's been excellent.
Right.
Thank you. And there you have it, as a good friend of mine says. So we've covered off the history of the Beatles, and we've got some insight from fans. I found this investigation and this research fascinating, and it really has opened up a different musical world for me. I have gone back and listened to a lot of the Beatles albums now, and I would recommend anyone who's ever thought, I don't know, or it's too retro, it's too old, seriously, give it a go. There is definitely something in their catalogue you are going to enjoy. It covers so many different things. Let me know what you thought of the albums if you do try them. Please contact me at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. Find me on Twitter at 20th Century Geek. On Facebook the same way, and I'm now on Instagram as well under 20th Century Geek. Hope you enjoy the show, and come back for next time, and we're going to look into the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. Thanks very much.